Newman. I'm a senior here at Edge, and this is my 4th year in the Edge program. Throughout the past 2 years, I've gotten involved with gardening through Edge. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on 2 projects that I work with through Edge. The first project is a Ferris garden bed planting project that I worked on my junior year and have continued into my senior year. And my second project that I'm going to focus on is senior capstone, and that is bringing seedlings to food bank. So the first project that I'm going to focus on today, as I said before, is Ferris Farms. So one of our projects, I took APES my junior year, and one of our projects in APES, which is our environmental science class, was to plant a garden. Within this, Mrs. Carpenter was looking for a student to help plant the vegetable beds at a farm that we had already partnered with before, Ferris. And she ended up coming up and approaching me, and I decided that I would be willing to help plant the beds at Ferris. So for the first thing that I did was decide to organize and try to figure out what crops would work in Ferris's space. So as you can see, here are a few of the vegetables that I considered planting. So one of the first constraints that I considered was that they wanted each season to have a harvest date, and they wanted a spring, summer, and fall rotation. So I made sure to list all of the seasons that each crop would go in. I made sure to list like their water needs and other things that would be important to Ferris. One of my other considerations was that because Ferris is volunteer run, they don't have access to labor all of the time, so I made sure to choose very low maintenance crops. That ended up being why I crossed out some of the more popular crops such as carrots. And then that was not the end of my research, because Ferris is a farm that is based on sustainability. The founder of the farm, Donald Ferris, was one of the first people to practice soil sustainability in the US. Additionally, I went to go into environmental science, and I care a lot about sustainability. So I made sure to research the most sustainable ways that this garden could come to be. So I looked into the soil science, and then one sustainable method of agriculture that I looked into a lot was companion planting, which is where you plant a plant next to something that is its friend or works with it. One key example of this is planting tomato next to basil, because basil helps to distract the tomato hornworm, and it helps so that the tomato hornworm does not invade. So I made sure to include plants next to our most vulnerable plants. I made sure to include some herbs that would help distract predators, so that hopefully the garden would be healthy. I also made sure to include crop rotation, which is where we rotate each bed on a seasonal basis, and this helps to reduce soil diseases, and it also helps to keep the soil healthy and fertilized, especially if you can include legumes, because that can act as a natural fertilizer and bring nitrogen into the soil without even adding anything like a fertilizer that you might buy from the garden store. And then it was 60% after all of my research. So I organized each of my garden beds, had a dedicated page, both for a diagram of where each plant in the garden bed was planted, and then I also had a description of the image, because a couple of the plants that I included were a bit obscure. Like, I don't think anyone had heard of the Chigia before we ended up planting it at Ferris. And then these ended up being all of my plants if you look at them in the spring, summer, and fall rotations. And I also included where trellises and supports would be needed, so that we would know what we needed to have as far as supports. And then planting. So planting did get to a little bit of a rough start, because initially when on our first planting date, they were supposed to bring the soil at 9 a.m. in the morning, and they did not end up bringing it that day at all. So we just moved the garden beds from where they were to another spot where they might have more sunlight and be able to thrive a little bit more. And then we went on the second field trip where we actually were able to get all of the seeds planted. During the summer, I visited Ferris periodically to help with garden upkeep and to make sure that everything was going smoothly. And our first season at Ferris ended up yielding 85 pounds of produce, mainly lettuce, radishes, peas, beets, and sweet potatoes. The majority of our harvest ended up going to food banks. In order to ensure the continuation of Ferris, I ended up having a sophomore offer to So that way we'll be able to ensure that our program does not fall to the wayside as we have people graduate. And my experience with fairs led me to want to pursue more with gardening my senior year for my senior capstone. For my senior capstone, I ended up deciding to make a food bank seedling program where I give out seedlings to people who visited food banks so that they could grow a bit of produce on their own. The reason that I chose a seedling bank and not creating a traditional garden program was that there are mental health benefits to growing plants. And this way, the people that I was giving the plants to could experience the mental health benefits on their own instead of just being able to get fresh produce. And they'd also, a lot of people just enjoy growing plants. When I considered plants for my second program, I had a few constraints that I needed to consider. First constraint that I needed to consider was that a lot of people in low-income communities live in apartments, and as such, they don't usually have yards or things that they could bring a plant outdoors. So I needed to make sure that each plant was well suited to being indoor. I also tried to make sure most plants would not only be okay if they were in a south-facing window, but in an east or west-facing window, again, because apartments might not have windows facing all directions. I also wanted to make sure that the crops were timely and that I would be able to bring them to the food bank twice per year. I did end up allowing an exception for tomatoes, which took all year to grow into their seedling size just because they are so popular. And then my final consideration was potting. I ended up using yogurt containers as pots, meaning I couldn't have anything with a really large seed depth unless I had a bigger container ready, and we only had a couple of extra large jars. So I ended up growing mostly things like lettuce and other things with lower root depth. My initial goal was to grow 40 to 50 plants for the food bank seedling program each semester. Unlike my work at Ferris, my work at the food bank required setting up as I had to initiate a partnership within the program. I ended up partnering with a food bank that my family had volunteered at a couple of times before, and I sent them an email and they immediately agreed to partner. It was much easier than I had expected. In the first round of seedlings, I planted in early September. I planted a lot of lettuce. There was also some radishes in some deeper containers, and then I think we also planted a few tomatoes. Unfortunately, this crop was ravaged by aphids, which are little green bugs that suck the life out of plants. So over half of the plants died, meaning I ended up needing to use other lettuce seeds that had started in order to bring enough seeds to the food bank, and even then I was still only able to bring 25 seeds. The second semester that was much more successful. I planted lettuce and basil, and there were just a couple of tomato plants, and by March I actually had 40 healthy seedlings, so I had surpassed my goal. And I was able to hand those out, and all of them went. And then overall across the year I had approximately 65 seedlings that I was able to hand out. Because of the success of this program, I wanted to ensure its continuation. I ended up having 2 volunteers offer, and over the summer we'll meet up and do a trial run with everybody so that we can get the program successfully transferred. I'm excited to use the knowledge that I've garnered from my time in Edge and my time working with plants. In my career, as I said before, I want to become an environmental science, and I'm considering pursuing a minor in agriculture, and Edge has really made that possible for me. And thank you for listening and for the past 4 years. I know that we keep saying that we wouldn't be where we are today without you, but that is really true.